So a lot of the organizations, JCRC's local mini APACs, such as exist in the California Policy Committee, are active in passing those. Now, whether or not they're constitutional should be decided fairly soon. Is the information given by me today available in the book? Some of it. The rest of the slides will be on the israelsinfluence.org website. And now I'd like to just pass it on to Roger Matson.
For their restrictions on their media. The truth is, due to constant, relentless pressure from supporters of Israel, our own media is profoundly restricted. We can criticize every country, including our own, except for Israel. Our speakers will discuss Israel's influence on television, print media, and in the film industry. So I have the great honor to introduce Rula Jebreal, who is here to present the second keynote address today. It's titled Voices Prohibited by Mainstream Media and its Role in Spreading Islamophobia. Then she will sit down and join our media panel. Rula Jebreal is an award-winning journalist, author, and foreign policy analyst. Her first autobiographical novel, Miral, sold 2 million copies and has been translated into 15 languages. Rula's dramatic screenplay turned Miral into a major motion picture, a rarity for any political film, not to mention a film telling a Palestinian story. Both are available at our Middle East Books booth, and she's signing those books during the reception tonight. Rula was born in Haifa and placed in the Dara Tifel orphanage, founded by the late Nishind al-Husseini in Jerusalem, where she received a superb education. I met her first at a luncheon hosted by Jumana Erekat, the wife of Palestinian ambassador Mayin Erekat. By the time she was 18, Rula told us, she was frustrated by the way Muslim Palestinians were portrayed in the media. I got tired of throwing my shoe at the TV, she told us. So Rula started writing her own articles. She received a scholarship from the Italian government, graduated, and later earned a master's degree in journalism and political science. Rula became the first first foreign anchor woman in the history of Italian television. Her career in American television has been more of a challenge, but I will let her tell her own story. Rula, please join us.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Delinda and everybody at the Washington Report. They've been very active lately, not only organizing this amazing conference, but I have to say, I received a phone call from Delinda 2 weeks ago, and I was visiting some friends in Florida who had some health issues, and Delinda said, well, I need to send you something urgently, and I think you would be fascinated by it. I didn't understand why she was secretive. Then Monday when I came back home and I opened, and there was this package of emails of some producer in Voice of America asking a former speaker of AIPAC if he would be fine that I would be the guest to debate whoever they deem as a proper Israeli official, eventually to debate him on television about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And obviously, I will, spare you some of these misogynist, sexist, disgusting details, the back and forth. But basically, this has been the way my career, somehow whenever I was hired by anybody in American media, and I love when they are about to prepare a war, whether it's a war in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and it's like, we are going to liberate women. We will teach these natives how to treat women. And then you read these emails, and it's like, sure. I'm sure you know exactly how to treat women and how to talk about them. It's fascinating to have, the superior culture. But it's a glimpse of the kind of power that they not only established, they exercise and wield shamefully, without any shame. But I am sure these emails were not the only emails. These are the emails that we knew of. These are emails that we had access to. But I am sure if you read private emails, internal emails of any news outlet, whether it's the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, you will find similar things where we're begging. Gideon said that the government is begging the Israeli government, and we want to give you the money, and they're saying basically, no, we want more, and somehow we need to kiss their hands. But the media has played a major role in making this happen. I grew up actually admiring American media. I grew up thinking American media is, this is a media that managed to expose major cases of corruption in the history and force a president to resign. This is the media that inspired me as a child, because I thought, you can live actually in a country where a simple journalist, a simple reporter can do his job or her job and can force the most powerful man in the land to answer some tough questions and eventually get, be forced to resign or be impeached. I thought that's the kind of dynamic of a vibrant democracy that makes this democracy vibrant. That's a kind of, journalism I didn't see around me. I grew up in watching Arabic televisions where I knew that somehow somebody in the government has written the questions and maybe the answers also. So I grew up with that kind of culture, thinking, something needs to change here. And I always looked up to Western media. So when I worked in Italian television, they hired me simply because I was the only woman that spoke Arabic. They needed somebody to understand the Middle East. They needed somebody that is native from the region to explain to them what went wrong. That famous article in Newsweek, what went wrong with the Arab Muslim world. And I remember going to my director and explaining to him the difference between Shia and Sunni and why the Iraq war will be disastrous, because just simply looking at the numbers, the composition of the population in Iraq, 60% Shia. They sent me to cover the Iraq war. I started my career in Italian television, and I always love to be underestimated because it gives me more, somehow more freedom, because as soon as they realize what they have, as soon as they realize what I was standing for, what I was doing, then these sexist, misogynist emails was some of the weapons they used and they throw against me. Obviously, it makes me laugh, but it makes me think that there's a lot to be done. American media has been the most disappointing thing I ever seen in my life. Even working in countries like Egypt, I've seen pushbacks by certain journalists, reporters, TV hosts, by far much more than in this country. And I'm saying that because I've seen what did that produce? Iraq was a worst choice. It was a non sequitur country that was invaded for a non-existential threat. And it could have happened only with a tacit, silent, and vocal consent of American media, who sold a lie. And none of these people have ever been fired. They actually been recycled, and they still called as experienced and experts on many issues, on the Iran nuclear deal, or and they're writing long essays about Obama's doctrine, as they call it. Nobody ever questioned their failures, their lies, their manipulation. None of that has happened. But they actually question the fact that, my hair is long or short, or I am skinny or fat. I mean, we're reduced to a level that allowed and enabled every lobbyist to get away with murder and basically paved the way for Donald Trump to become the front runner. I think we're responsible of that. And it reminds me very much of the media in Egypt and Italy before the revolution. So when, the title of the conference, is this good for America? Not only it's bad, Israel influence here goes beyond Israel and Israeli borders. If you think of the larger dynamic in the Middle East, if you think how much money, we're talking about $4 billion to Israel, think of the $2 billion to Egypt. These $2 billion are paid to the Egyptian regime that basically created a deep police state, a deep state, and doomed democracy in that country. This is the country that gave us Zawahiri, #1 of Al-Qaeda today. This is the country that gave us political Islam. Inside the prison cells, the most atrocity has been committed. Torture since the 60s that basically radicalized an entire generation. And they left with one idea: transnational jihad. Go after the regime, create terrorist groups to go after the regime, blow up themselves. And guess what? Every one of their backers, starting with the United States. So somehow we enabled a government that produced mass radicalization. And why? Because of one issue, because of the Camp David Accords, because of the Camp David Accords. Basically, we still give money to a regime that is committing atrocities and violating human rights and killing thousands of people and imprisoning 60,000 as we speak today, because of that peace accord with Israel, or to keep the peace with Israel, or to do Israel dirty jobs. For example, closing the borders with Gaza. The other ally that is, we never not only question it, but if you think of what Israel has been trying to push the United States to do, it goes beyond the Israel-Palestinian issue. We had Bibi Netanyahu, who came here to testify in 2002, and his words was, we need to go into Iraq because it will have do the regime change that we need to do, because this will have a positive effect on the entire region. I mean, you look at the region, I don't see any area where this positive effects you can see. But the whole issue was one, and they've been vocal about it. And the one issue is, now they don't even care about the Palestinian issue, basically. What they care about is the Iran issue. And the Iran issue has been the focus of this government for the last 20 years. So you have the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, Sylvain Shalom, and even the former Ambassador Oren, who basically are telling us that they rather have Sunni radical groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front than any Shia group. As if the answer to the region is, yes, let's wage war on the Shiites, and the Sunni who gave us every, not only radical group, every group that have committed atrocities are actually, we can't turn a blind eye on these guys. This is the same reasoning, this is the same mindset of the Cold War. This is exactly the same mindset and never changed. As if they are not realizing that the post-colonial order that's been established in the Middle East have collapsed already. Doesn't exist anymore. And it collapsed because of their choices. The Iraqi war basically ended that post-colonial era. But they are still thinking as if they're living in 1979. The mentality of the Mujahideen was that mentality. There's a Russian invasion, so the Russians are the enemies, and this is the Cold War mentality. So we need to create an alliance with whoever is there to defeat that monster. So we created a Frankenstein monster that is turning on all of us. And we keep repeating the same strategies and the same mistakes. And I understand that it's hard for a politician to change because they are beholden to the checkbooks of Sheldon Adelson and Haim Saban. Somehow, sadly they call it legal corruption in my world. Here they call it Citizen United. But the real failure has been my colleagues, the people who are sitting on television with a revolving door. They served as a person for AIPAC the 10 years earlier, and then they are on CNN as a neutral TV host, or some prison guard who served is lecturing people on some website on how they need to be or to behave as journalists. Somehow the system allowed for these voices to thrive and to become the establishment voices. And when you listen to people debating, how did we not understand that Trump, would become a front runner? The signs were all there. The writing were on the walls. What were you thinking when for years, since 9/11, the idea of us and them became from marginal idea became a mainstream idea. The them, was your neighbor who was Muslim or Sikh or eventually, Hasidic Jew. Or diversity, the war on diversity started by eliminating critical voices in mainstream media in the United States. I mean, I can't even fathom till now how is possible that in a country that led serious investigative journalism and led to push an administration to resign with Nixon can be the country that allowed not only an administration to abuse their power and pass secret memos and spy on their citizens or torture some people. Are surprised today, and some of these speakers are intelligent, surprised that you have fascists on the rise and basically telling you that you didn't actually do enough. When I listen to these debates and I have some of my colleagues who don't even have a follow-up question on some of these candidates who are not only calling to commit war crimes, but they are saying it's not even enough. You need to, expand those war crimes because, waterboarding is not enough. You need maybe to kill him in order and kill his family and his relatives because this is what will make us all safe. Look, I never been in my entire life. I never worked so hard to make people understand what are the stakes. But I'm concerned for the next generation because, when I grew up, obviously I watched that kind of journalist of Dan Rather and others. I think our children are growing up, if they're if they're 15, 16, or 14, and they look for people to inspire them. I mean, if that person is Anderson Cooper, I want to jump from a window. The follow-up question matter more than the question itself, to push back and to, if your job is actually to expose lies, corruption, and deflections and push them to answer it, and the only person has been doing this somehow, and surprisingly, and I'm horrified to say that, has been people on Fox News. I mean, we're looking at Megyn Kelly as the person who managed to actually challenge some of these candidates. So, but we looked for years at the first African-American president being smacked by the leader of a country of 7 million people. And here you have a country of 300 million people, supposedly the leader of the free world. And with Congress basically accepting that and allowing that, that can lead only in one direction. This is the beginning of dismantling of a democracy of this country. And this is what is worrisome. The Israeli model is not contained in Israel. It's being transported and it's becoming part of the American model. So when you have police brutality and the cozy relationship in the media, it's becoming a cozy relationship in the police departments. So the police, who abuse their powers in Ferguson has been trained actually by Israeli police, and it's considered normal. Nobody's investigating these kind of cozy relationship. I am proud actually to be sitting with Philip Weiss here, who reported about some of these executives at CNN who are speechwriters for Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, there's the level of cooperation and propaganda has reached such a level that today it's normal. We are the abnormal. We are the aberration. These people are writing the chapter of this nation history. I can't believe that I'm mentioning, this is the quote from Gramsci, my favorite European intellectual who wrote from his prison cells. And he was asked about Mussolini. And he said Mussolini was not an aberration. Mussolini was an autobiography of a nation. He was part of this nation. He was enabled by the media. He was himself a journalist. He was enabled by a system that turned a blind eye. I think we need to push harder and we need to fight more. And I think we need to create a community that is, we are part of an ecosystem that can help each other to expose this more. We cannot allow ourselves to I mean, I can't, obviously 15 years ago I used to throw my shoe at the television. I can't do this anymore. I'm very happy to be ejected from certain TV networks, but I'm very happy actually to be part of a system that whatever Philip or Max Blumenthal and other people write, we need to cooperate so we can push that message. And it can't be a parallel world. It must be a united world, because the wave that is coming is by far much more dangerous. I've seen it in other places. I've seen it in Europe, and I've seen it in the Middle East. And these people are beyond ruthless. Berlusconi, when he was elected in 1994, the first 3 things that he did, he sued 18 journalists, kicked 18 others from television, from networks, people who dared to criticize him. Some of them were my friends, Marco Travaglio or Santoro and others. I worked for an Egyptian television. In 2009, after 6 months, I had to leave because the level of bullying and abuse was beyond me. I couldn't control it. It wasn't about me. It was about the people who worked with me. And I knew that while the establishment was talking about the transfer of power from the father, Mubarak, to his son, the people were talking about actually 3 things. And these 3 things still exist. They were talking about freedom, democracy, and dignity. And this is what I kept hearing from the ground. So the detachment between the base and the establishment, and the gap is so deep, but we need to stay tuned with the base, because actually the base will lead the change. I don't believe the establishment will anymore, but I believe the base, the millions of people who were neglected around the Arab world, stood up one morning, apparently without any reason. 3 months earlier, Hillary Clinton said it's a stable country, and people ignored those voices to such extent that they didn't even bother to think or to ask them what you want, what you think. These people stood in the streets and demanded dignity. They overthrew a regime, they had setbacks, but that kind of power, that kind of sentiment is still out there. It's not dead. It's dormant, but it's not dead. I am sure it will rise again. I am sure, like I'm looking at you. And I hope in that moment we'll be ready to help them and build a bigger bridge, a bridge that will unite us here and in the Middle East. And it will not be about them and us, but it will be about all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're reminding me of Gideon Levy's speech last year. He called for an American spring, and I think we are all inspired. Well, next, Philip Weiss is an American journalist who is the founder and co-editor with Adam Horowitz of Mondoweiss, the widely read news website devoted to covering American foreign policy in the Middle East, chiefly from a progressive Jewish perspective. Phil began his career in mainstream journalism, writing for the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Esquire, and the New York Observer. In 2006, while at the Observer, he began writing a daily blog called Mondoweiss. As he began to explore more deeply the relationship between American Jews and Israel, however, the Observer became increasingly uncomfortable. So, in 2007, Phil established Mondoweiss as an independent blog, and today it is a valuable source of news and opinion from a variety of authors. We're so very glad to have Phil here with us today to share his observations on the New York Times and the coverage of Israel over the years. Please join me in welcoming Philip Weiss.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Delinda. I just have to say that Rula's invocation of the Vietnam War and what journalists did around the Vietnam War was very important to me, too, as a young journalist. And I remember that I was at the Philadelphia Daily News 35 years ago, and the guy at the next desk had read Harrison Salisbury's book about the Pentagon Papers. And that was when the New York Times took on the government. The government tried to shut down the New York Times publication of this vital document that explained the history of the Vietnam War. And the Times stood up to the government, and it helped to bring, well, it took a while, but it was very important in bringing an end to the American participation in that disaster. And my friend at the next desk said, let's write to Harrison Salisbury. We're never going to get a story like that. And so we wrote this letter and we said, Dear Mr. Salisbury, how do you plan your career? We were just young, ambitious journalists. How do you plan your career so that you can, get ready to take on the government and, have a big story like that? And what I remember about his letter is that he said, just hang in there, learn to be good journalists, work hard, and someday you will get your big story. And the thing I find really moving about that now is that, in fact, we did get that big story. We got it in the shape of the Iraq War, and just what American foreign policy has been in the last 10 years. And the New York Times has been AWOL on that one. And I think I may have said this the last time, that gives tremendous power to our community. If you think about how much information that people in this community are developing in the way that journalists are supposed to develop, traditionally have developed information that's vital. Even this fact that both Rula and Colonel Wilkerson said earlier about the extent to which the aid package to Egypt is essentially a bribe to keep them, to hold the... This is a central fact of our foreign policy that just you won't find stated, and that is on a par with anything that was in the Pentagon Papers in terms of a vital understanding. So I'm here to talk about the New York Times chiefly because the Times sort of sets the parameters and the tone for the mainstream discussion. And I did once do some work at the Times, worked staffer at the Times Magazine. And I thought I would just anatomize the Times a little and then move on to the whys of it. Why is the Times sort of in the tank for Israel? So the newspaper has been a reliable Israel supporter for a long time now, and we keep looking for signs of a thaw. And I think, I'm going to be hopeful, but let me first describe the character of that support. And I will be describing, as I go through my remarks, I'll be using the term Zionism, and I think that Zionism is embedded. It's a very important force at the New York Times. And what I mean by that is some degree of commitment to the idea of the need for a Jewish state and the need to preserve a Jewish state in Israel. So the Times has at least 3 columnists who are openly Zionist. And those are David Brooks, who has said that he gets gooey-eyed about Israel when he thinks about Israel, and has been there a dozen times. It was a couple of years ago. I think he's been there more since. Roger Cohen, who says that Israel is justified by the Holocaust, but he can also be somewhat critical of the occupation. He is openly a Zionist, which I think is a very good thing in as much as he's frank about his adherence to the ideology. And then there's Paul Krugman, who is a liberal Zionist who says he's critical of Israel, but never expresses it. He says as little as possible. You would think that winning a Nobel Prize and having a Times column would give you freedom, but Krugman surely demonstrates Tolstoy's principle that the higher you get, the less freedom you have. And I'm leaving that other stratospheric columnist, Tom Friedman, out of this list because while Friedman began his career as an Israel supporter back in the suburbs of Minneapolis, doing chalk talks on the Six-Day War at his high school, I think that one of the principles of this conference is that people can change. And I sense that Friedman has fallen away from the ideology, inasmuch as he has said, for instance, that Congress is bought and paid for by the Israel lobby, which is a statement that if a non-Jew made it, would brand them as an anti-Semite. I think the standard is not being nice enough about Israel. He has also said recently that the two-state solution is a failure, and that that failure was produced by, among others, Netanyahu and Sheldon Adelson and the right-wing Jewish influence, openly speaking of right-wing Jewish influence. And that was a very important column, and I'll return to it because I think it's the heart of what I always understood journalism to be. Not quite the heart, because I always understood journalism to be what's new, true, and important. And it's true and it's important, it's just not new, what Friedman was telling us. So I think you may know that David Brooks's son served in the Israeli military, and he's one of 4 times reporters who have had children who serve in the Israeli military. The most celebrated example of this was Ethan Bronner, who was the previous Jerusalem bureau chief. His son entered while he was writing for the Times, and it was shortly after Cast Lead, when Israel slaughtered 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza. And it caused Palestinian activists, in a truly masterful act of branding, to paint the New York Times logo on the apartheid wall. I don't know if you saw images of this, but it was just kind of wonderful. Bronner introduced a guessing game into journalism about unspoken ideological agendas. This was, is he or is he not a Zionist? And I think that I participated in this guessing game. A lot of journalists in the blogosphere did. And when he left the newspaper, ultimately in the last year or so, I mean, he left less and less doubt about this question, and resolved it entirely, well, when he hosted right-wing Israeli military figures at the 92nd Street Y in New York on a program that was about the quote-unquote incredible courage of Israeli soldiers. So when we started the same guessing game when Ethan Bronner's successor, Jody Rudoran, took over after him in Jerusalem. And I remember that I sort of I was a little bit more credulous than others. I'm not proud of this. And I sort of thought, oh, she's going to be fair. And then but what we found was that she wrote totally out of the Israeli Jewish experience. That was really the community that she's openly admitted that she related to more, but she made little effort to get outside that comfort zone. So there were long pieces about young Israelis getting tattoos, when their grandparents had had Auschwitz tattoos. There was an episode where she went to Gaza in 2012 and on Facebook said that Palestinians were ho-hum about death of family members. She went to a funeral in Gaza and observed that Palestinians were, quote, ho-hum about death of family members. It was it was a shocking incident, and something she had to apologize for, but it wasn't a prejudice that she seemed to want to shed or to get out of. Recently, she gave some podcast where she said that she spoke 1 word of Arabic. Actually, I'm sure she speaks more Arabic, I mean, in that there are a lot of Arabic words in our language. I mean, alcohol and algebra to begin with. But it's a reflection of her deep in curiosity about the Palestinian experience. And it's kind of white citizen council journalism that you see in the Times a lot and that she exhibited. So I remember, because she was more adept at this guessing game about her commitment to Israel as a Jewish state, she said, the only ist I am is a journalist. When she was asked about this question, I'm not a Zionist, the only ist I am is a journalist. And I remember that I once wrote that she comes out of a Zionist background. And she was upset about even that, being identified in even that fashion, and said, well, why would you say that? And I said, well, you know, you've said to Jewish groups, when you've spoken to them, that you are familiar with the American Jewish experience and the American Jewish concern for Israel, and you came to Israel when you were in high school with United Synagogue Youth. You know, that's a Zionist background. And she said, you know, I went to Lake Winnipesaukee too. So it was one of the most disingenuous deflections I've ever experienced. I mean, because those trips by United Synagogue Youth and other Jewish organizations were highly ideological in character. They weren't like vacations in the White Mountains, and they were. It was a measure of her how obtuse she could be that she would make that kind of statement. In my one meeting with Ruth Doran, I told her that her great challenge was to tell Americans that this was 4 years ago, that the two-state solution is over, and that. If you just go to the West Bank, you see that it's over. They won't be able to make a viable Palestinian state there. Those people don't want to leave. Just a little bit of an ad. Some of the journalism I've done myself lately about the West Bank, which we have out in the adjoining room, and that I said that, you know, she had to explain this to elites. This was a vital function of a journalist to sort of to bring this news, and she never did that. And it's not just that I made this challenge. You'll notice recently that John Kerry and Dan Shapiro from the State Department have both said, you know, we're approaching this one-state reality. Well, they've gotten no support from the leading American newspaper to explain what that one-state reality is. So the Times has sort of abandoned this kind of vital journalistic function of telling people what's going on in this kind of most important American relationship that exists. And I think that again is one of the great things about this Tom Friedman column, was he said the Israelis don't want to leave. They've been supported in the West Bank. They've been supported by right-wing American Jews, and they just want an unending civil. It's going to be an unending civil war with greater and greater isolation of Israel on the world stage. All true, and this has been true for the last 5-8 years, I think at least. And yet now a Times columnist and the Secretary of State are the people who are bringing this information. So in the time I have left. And by the way, I think that there is something very cruel about maintaining the illusion about the two-state solution, because it is it's saying that, oh, these horrible conditions, they're just temporary. These people, 5 million, you know, people under some form of apartheid or ghettoization, you know, in Gaza, in a prison. We're gonna take care of that soon. And so it's prevaricating about a tremendous human rights atrocities all the time. It's white Citizens Council journalism. And if you think about the great Jewish seer Rabbi Hillel, who said, if not now, when? This is a situation which demands, if not now, when? And the position of the Times is kind of whenever, and the position of these people who preserve the illusion of the two-state solution is kind of whenever, with respect to a tremendous amount of suffering, as Susie so beautifully showed us. So I brought in the Jewish piece, the parochial Jewish piece. I'm one of the American Jews who is in this in the conference today, and in my parochial capacity, I would just have to acknowledge that, you know, Zionism comes out of the Jewish community. It was an answer to Jewish persecution in Europe, and was embraced by the world, or the Western world, the colonial world, as a solution of the Jewish question of Europe. And now that and it won Jews to its side through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And now what we're seeing is because of the unending, the 50-year occupation, we're seeing even inside the Jewish community some questioning of this ideology. And I think that if Bernie Sanders says there is a war for the soul of Islam, America has to help Islam in that respect, there's also a war for the soul of Judaism right now. Whether this is a religious conflict or not, I'm not getting into that, but to the degree that the Jewish community, American Jewish community, including large parts of the New York Times itself, where Jews of my generation are working in great number, to the extent that the American Jewish community embraced this ideology and married this ideology and saw it as a deliverance ideology, that's something that is now beginning to come undone among younger Jews. And so I would remind you, if you don't know it, that there was a time when the New York Times was anti-Zionist. When it did not see Zionism as the answer, it said, our homeland is here. We don't want our patriotism undermined by the creation of a Jewish state, and we're going to oppose it. And we're not going to send Jewish reporters over to Jerusalem because their loyalty, we don't want to place them in a position where there's any question about where our loyalty lies. So that era passed in the 1960s. The Times ultimately became an organization where many Zionist Jews work, and I think that there are no anti-Zionists openly at the Times, but that will come. It's bound to, because of the changes, not just in the Jewish community, but throughout the American community, which is, I think, what we've witnessed at this conference. It's one of the, I think, the great things about this conference, that it has brought together so many diverse perspectives: American interest, Israelis, left-wing, Palestinian solidarity people, and anti-Zionist Jews as well. And I think that, again, just to return to what I said at the beginning, this gives our community tremendous power from the storytelling, journalistic perspective. We are the ones who are developing this information, who are working through these extremely difficult questions of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, separating those. We are developing experience about talking about these things, and that will also make us information leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I really recommend everyone starting off their day with a column, reading all the columns on Mondoweiss. Thank you very much for your work. So we've had TV media, we've had talking about the mainstream press. Now we're going to talk about Israel's influence on the film industry. And Catherine Jordan is the award-winning producer and co-editor of Valentino's Ghost, Why We Hate Arabs. A journalist for 14 years, Catherine spent 5 years working with director Michael Singh to shape this film, first released and mightily suppressed in 2013. Viewers from 127 countries watched Valentino's Ghost when it was featured on Al Jazeera English in 2015. Valentino's Ghost has just been re-released, and copies are available from Middle East Books and More's booth or website. It now includes the Israeli bombing of Gaza, the Charlie Hebdo murderers, the Hollywood film American Sniper, and Donald Trump's anti-Muslim crusade. Catherine was an editor and staff writer for the Los Angeles Times and a correspondent for the Daily Telegraph in London, the Hollywood Reporter, Los Angeles Magazine, the Tatler, the New Scotsman. She has spent 3 years as a writer at Hollywood's Paramount Studios, researching Paramount's theatrical library of 2,500 films. Jordan was honored at the Muslim Public Affairs Council 2014 Media Awards as a voice of courage and conscience for her role in producing Valentino's Ghost. Please welcome this gifted film producer.
I'm the final act. I'm just going to talk for 4 minutes and then show you some of our film. The director of the film, Michael Singh, is in Egypt today, where he showed the full film last night in Tahrir Square in Cairo. He emailed me to tell me that the sound was out of sync with the picture by 3 or 4 seconds, and despite this disastrous blunder, it was met with enormous enthusiasm by the crowd, so this is good. Most Americans have been hearing from the media all their lives that the Middle East is somehow inherently in a permanent, inexplicable state of crisis. By media, I mean traditional television news, newspapers, magazines, and no less importantly, the narratives that we see in movies, even in children's cartoons. Like most people in this country, I never understood why they couldn't all just get along. Until I got involved with this film, in fact, I always came away from media coverage of the Middle East with the conclusion that it was just somehow far too complicated to understand, and that it was all over my head. And the media seemed to convey a worldview that Palestinians and other Arabs were just somehow inherently violent and irrational people, doing hijackings throughout the 1970s and endless suicide bombings for seemingly no reason. After 9/11, I think a lot of people in our country found themselves asking huge questions. Who are these people? Why are they so angry? And how is it that I know so little about this subject? Our film, I'm very pleased to say, after this amazing day, enshrines much of what has been said today by all the incredible speakers. We seek to expose and explain the reasons behind our longstanding hatred and fear of Arabs, Muslim, and Islam in this country. We also seek to show that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and especially that of Israel, is what really dictates public perceptions and attitudes toward the Middle East in this country, and has done so for more than a century. It should astonish and appall the public that the mainstream media typically goes right along with the government's narrative. And then, in turn, the government brandishes those media reports and says, see, here's the evidence right here on the front page of the New York Times. The yellow cake debacle in Iraq was a flagrant example of this, but certainly not the only one. And so the government then recycles those stories to further reinforce their own narrative in support of policy decisions and military invasions and so on. So there's a vicious circle here. The stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims inform the behavior of policymakers, who then create policies which unashamedly place an extremely low value on the lives of Palestinians and others in the Arab world. And then the policies, in turn, reinforce the news and the entertainment industry, and so on. And so what you get is this self-reinforcing cycle, this infinite loop, if you will, and with very destructive results. This cycle shows the enormous power of the mass media to shape the public's ideas and mold our opinions for us. So I feel it's really valuable for us to be able to tell this story in the medium of film, which, of course, we believe can have a very powerful impact, and a medium which has a lasting impact and can now be widely shared in the digital era by huge numbers of people. 2 months ago, our film was broadcast worldwide on the Al Jazeera English network. As I'm sure you all know, the network is an English-language TV news network carried in more than 100 countries around the world. So the film ran in Great Britain, it ran throughout Asia, it ran throughout Europe. and it ran to a potential subscriber base of 130 million households, which sounds like a fantastic success. However, there was one country that wasn't on the list, the United States. You knew that was coming. The film did not play in the United States and has not played in its full feature length in the United States. Again, we were thrilled when our film premiered at the Venice Film Festival, which, along with the Cannes Festival, is the most difficult festival to get into in the world of filmmaking. It's almost unheard of, in fact, that the Venice Festival accepts a documentary film. And the film was welcomed in 12 other festivals in Europe and Asia. But every major festival in the United States has turned us down. A top-tier festival for a filmmaker is a launching pad. It's a marketplace. It's where you get attention, and it's where you sell your film to a distributor. Often right there at the festival itself is where the meetings take place and the deal is made. So it's key to the success of your film. So after our success in Venice, where the film got a standing ovation and a lot of good press buzz, our phone started ringing, with all the major US festivals saying they'd heard great things about the film. Some of them had seen it at Venice, and they'd like to show it. So could they view a DVD for consideration for their festival? Even Michael Moore called us to get it into his annual festival. So we submitted DVDs of the film to the selection committees of all these top-notch festivals at their behest, and then we never heard from any of them again, across the board. There was a virtual blackout. You are all familiar with this. Maybe the film wasn't good enough? You have to face that as a filmmaker. Was it just not good enough? We looked at that. That said, and with all due humility, our film received a standing ovation at Venice. It received a glowing review in the New York Times and in the Los Angeles Times and in the Village Voice. And the New York Times designated it a favorite critics' pick, which is a real honor. And the magazine The American Conservative published a brilliant feature saying that our film essentially got it right. Yet, we had a blackout from US festivals and distributors. So ironically, the very forces which we're trying to expose and discuss in the film are the very forces that are essentially virtually suppressing wide distribution in our film in our own country. Maybe we should have thought of that after spending years and years and years making this film. But we persevered. Perhaps if the wider public is actually informed and educated on this issue and learns the answers to so many questions, maybe we can begin to take the steps toward a future not of violence, but of peace. I'd like to show you a few clips from the film right now, and just by way of explanation, it's not a tightly edited trailer that you're typically used to seeing. It's just a series of short clips or excerpts plucked from throughout the whole duration of the film. So, thank you.
Media is so central to how Americans think about things. It didn't happen if it didn't come on TV. It didn't happen if we don't have a picture of it.
Where do these images come from? What is the relationship between these images and American foreign policy in the Middle East?
What's their impact? Why do they matter? America's love affair with Arabia reached a frenzy with the 1920 British erotic novel, The Sheikh. And Hollywood immediately turned it into a film starring Rudolph Valentino. The Sheikh would create the most popular male sex symbol in the history of American cinema.
What ended America's love affair with Arabia was actual contact. The West was invading the Arabs' land, and the meetings were violent and hate-filled. As with news headlines, most movies depicted Arabs as assaulting the foreigners, not defending their homeland. The European political movement, which chose Palestine as a destination for Jewish settlers, called itself Zionism.
They decided to go to the land of Palestine, and there was a technicality because there were Palestinian people living there. So they came up with this mantra that it's a land without a people for a people without a land, which was totally false.
The Jews created the state of Israel and ethnically cleansed large parts of Palestine. What many people forget is that the Israelis themselves used terrorism as the principal weapon for driving the British out of the Middle East between 1945 and 1948 and garnering a state of their own for the Jewish people. Terrorism was one of the main weapons. Many supporters of Israel like to make the argument that the reason that the Israelis are so heavy-handed, the reason they have to build a wall, the reason they have to occupy huge amounts of Palestinian territory is that they have to cap the volcano. They have to keep these Palestinian terrorists under control. This line of argument has the causal arrow backwards. It is the occupation that is causing terrorism. It is not terrorism that is causing the occupation.
America has to defend its interests. How? By giving force and blood to this military base, which is Israel, in order that Israel will crush any Arab liberation movement which will say to the American, out, this is our property. Therefore, our real enemy is not only Israel, it is Israel totally backed by America.
Will you take action against Americans and American interests?
Suppose we have. Do you expect me to tell you?
Within 2 years, the portrait of the articulate Palestinian commando disappeared almost completely, as did media investigations into the root cause of the violence.
It now said that there were 11 hostages. They're all gone.
Presenting Palestinians as freedom fighters or even as terrorists with a human dimension was gone in the blink of an eye.
In every case, it was said that those who oppose Israel are against the forces of goodness in the world. They're evil.
And take back Bon Kadam to honor the Hebrew God whose ark this is.
And so, Arabs come out very badly in this scenario. Those who were in conflict with Israel were in conflict with God.
If America does not start pressuring Israel to give up land, I believe that God will bring this nation into judgment because I believe what this book says.
All right, Muslims think they're the chosen. Jews invented the whole idea of being chosen. It's like, you know, I got Muslim cousins that, Harun, listen, you have to understand, God chose us. No, God chose us, you see. He promised us this land. You see this uninhabitable desert right there? God promised it to us. He gave it to us. Okay?
Why do British rock stars, film stars, journalists, and other influential voices bring images of Palestinians to the world while their American counterparts remain silent?
In Washington and called the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. It employs several professional lobbyists to push the Israeli cause on Capitol Hill.
This report is one of the few American television broadcasts ever to investigate the highly influential Israel lobby. It aired over 30 years ago. A surprisingly rare news event, it gave Americans more information about the lobby than anything found in the mainstream media since that time.
Israel's struggle is our struggle.
The United States will stand with Israel now and forever.
Israel is not alone in this fight, nor will she ever be.
It is very difficult for mainstream journalists to talk about Israel in a critical way. And I've talked to a number of journalists who fully understand this and who in private will say just what I said.
There's sometimes a gutlessness that we don't want to push the boundaries of what can be written or what can't be written, and to me that's the problem.
What's going on here is definitely not a conspiracy. This is not a cabal. What's going on here is good old-fashioned interest group politics. Anytime anyone, whether that person is Jewish or not, criticizes Israel, or criticizes Israeli policy, or criticizes the U.S.-Israeli relationship, he or she is almost certain to be labeled an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew by the Israel lobby. Of course, that's exactly what happened to us.
Why isn't there a more fundamental debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about, the conflict itself? I don't know. I ask myself the same question, and I don't have the answer.
In the piece, we referred to the charge of anti-Semitism as the Great Silencer.
We got a really spectacular terrorist event, and we got a very, very rapid, dramatis personae cast list, and lo and behold, they were all them guys. So, don't you think that they're the guys we should be frightened of?
The 9/11 Commission, you would think, would have investigated the question of why they hate us and why we were attacked on 9/11. But in fact, the 9/11 Commission was not able to investigate that all-important question in any meaningful way.
We talked about Israeli policy.
We'd like to address.
Yeah, but why are we addressing the gorilla in the room? The gorilla in the room is U.S. support for Israel. You had made a mistake earlier. Yeah. You had said that the Israeli-Palestinian dispute wasn't addressed in the 9/11 Commission report. I beg to differ with that. On page 147, it is stated that the plotter of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was driven to attack us not because of radical ideology, as Prime Minister Blair, because of U.S. support for Israel. Why aren't we addressing that, sir?
This is a conversation that you and I ought to have, but let's not take the time of our resource people. May we go to the next question, please? Thank you very much.
Because the answer would have been that our relationship with Israel is one of the main reasons that we have a terrorist problem. And the Israel lobby does not want that message to get out to the American people, because it would then force Washington to change its policies towards Israel.
But what have you found out about why these men did what they did? What motivated them to do it?
The answer is unknown to most Americans because the government and the media have not made it available. Here it is.
I believe they feel a sense of outrage against the United States. They identify with the Palestinian problem. They identify with people who oppose repressive regimes. And I believe they tend to focus their anger on the United States.
It is widely seen in the Muslim world that the West is going after, is attacking Islam.
Cette Jamel, tu comprends ce que je veux dire? Si on commence à pas faire de dessin pour pas choquer les musulmans, si on fait, c'est de l'autocensure, c'est la fin de la liberté.
On the same show, the host applies a different set of rules regarding hate speech when it comes to mocking Jewish people.
Vous pensez pas que c'était à vous de vous excuser, non? En disant le sketch n'était pas très drôle, je suis désolé si j'ai... Pourquoi tout d'un coup sur un sujet on ne pourrait pas s'exprimer? Vous savez bien pourquoi on ne peut pas s'exprimer. Pourquoi? Parce que dans ce pays, on a envoyé pendant la guerre des juifs dans des chambres à gaz.
The protection against hate speech provided to Jews but not Muslims was present at Charlie Hebdo magazine itself. In 2008, a Charlie Hebdo cartoonist wrote a column that was seen by some as anti-Semitic.
This gentleman who was poking fun at Sarkozy's son was effectively fired from the magazine because he had behaved in an unacceptable way. With regard to Muslims, there's almost nothing that's unacceptable. It's a no-holds-barred atmosphere. This hypocrisy, this double standard is what enrages Muslims. What Charlie Hebdo was doing in this instance was cultural bullying. Their basic belief was that because this group had little power, it would not be able to retaliate. When you engage in bullying, sometimes the person you bully reaches the breaking point, and he or she retaliates.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has had a huge impact on how Americans see the Middle East.
I think the media has been absolutely unfair to Israel, not only in the United States, but around the world. Look,
what the public sees and hears about the Middle East often comes from politicians and is then passed along to the public by an unquestioning and cooperative media.
A-Day, shock and awe, as it's being called by Pentagon officials, is just only starting.
The fact is that a whole group of propagandists who specialize in the use and misuse of words and semantics are able to produce a narrative of the Middle East which is fundamentally flawed. And journalists quickly pick up on this. You change and diminish the language of the conflict. The wall becomes the fence or the barrier. The occupation zone becomes the security zone. The occupied territories becomes disputed territories. Settlements become neighborhoods. When a picture of a dead baby appears in Time magazine, it says, killed in crossfire. It was killed by Israeli shells, but it said killed in crossfire. It's crossfire when it's Palestinians killed by Israelis. But when you get an Israeli shot by a Palestinian, it is a murder, a terrorist act. And so we make the Middle East unintelligible for people who don't live there or visit there.
A photographer captured these images of the boys running for their lives.
Are those Hamas targets?
The military, the Israeli military, only targets legitimate military targets.
A second rocket, apparently targeting them, came in.
It's very carefully chosen through multiple layers of intelligence.
The United Nations run school was being used as a shelter, and this was struck allegedly by Israeli tank fire.
A lot of training goes into this, a careful consideration goes into this.
We understand that at least 15 were killed, including 2 children and United Nations staff.
Max, let's start with you. There is no conflict between Israel and Palestine. Israel-Palestine is a single unitary state, and it is a conquest being carried out by the Jewish state in order to dispossess and ghettoize as many Palestinians as possible. It's been going on for 70 years as part of 70 years of dispossession, ghettoization, and expulsion in order to consolidate the ethnic purity of the Jewish state.
More and more American Jews are having difficulty dealing with the fact that Israel has turned itself into an apartheid state.
The image of Arabs as a subjugated people in an Israeli apartheid state is not accepted by most American politicians, who sustain a much more positive image of Israel and its leaders.
I want to thank you, Democrats and Republicans, for your common support for Israel, year after year, decade after decade.
So listen, Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. We have no choice. We have no choice.
So here's a question for you. How can we get that movie into all the TV networks, to theaters? How can we get that out here?
Is this on?
Yes.
We've been turned down by HBO, Showtime, PBS. We've been trying to get the film distributed by all the big networks. We ran a 1-hour version of the film, was run on 30 or 40 PBS stations, but it's a boring distinction, but an important one. It wasn't an official PBS film. It was provided by a third party as content for PBS stations to run it if they chose. And the results of that was that plenty of people ran it, but it had zero marketing. And when there's zero marketing, you might as well not even run the film because no one knows it's coming and no one just makes the time to see it. So that had a tiny little ripple of an effect. So we're still seeking wide distribution in this country anyway.
Thank you. And one more question for you before we go to the next questions. Was the Sundance Independent Film Festival contacted, and what was their reaction to the film?
Yes. We sent the film to Sundance with their encouragement. One of our colleagues who was a consultant on the film has a big position at the Sundance Film Festival, and she said she'd talk to her friends. And the reviewer who looked at it actually emailed us on the QT and said she thought it was a fantastic film and it was one of the better films that she'd seen, and that it was too political for Sundance. And of course we did not get in. So.
Okay. This question is, I think, for Rula. A lot of these questions are for Rula here. I asked an LA Times reporter, how can he participate in the distortion of the news? He said, if I can get them to leave 10% of my copy uncensored, it is worthwhile to continue. Please comment. And maybe that goes for all of you. Do you want to start? Okay. So
the LA Times reporter made that statement, that if he can get his editors to leave
10% of it uncensored, it's worthwhile to continue. Did you find censorship?
That's a good ratio, No, I mean, censorship, self-censorship, it's part of media life. I mean, if we could get away with 10% on this issue, we'd revolutionize America. I mean, right now, it's like it's a 90% censorship ratio. So give it to me, 10%. I love it. I mean, I just want to reflect. When I was at the New York Times Magazine, I did a.
Oh, 90%.
When I was at the New York Times Magazine, I did a cover story on the gun lobby, and I wrote a very long article sending up the NRA and talking about their sexual fetishization of guns and everything else. And you've never seen an article in the New York Times Magazine about the Israel lobby with 1/10 of that kind of free speech involved. So.
There's a cozy relationship. I mean, one of the reasons that made me actually, in 2014, do what I did on MSNBC was, these officials would be, Israeli officials, would be like 99% of the time, and they would never be challenged, as the documentary represent. They would never be asked about the occupation or the siege, or it's like, I remember I almost choked on my coffee one morning, and I was watching Schiefer interviewing Bibi Netanyahu, and in the end of the interview, obviously it was softball questions, like, Mr. Prime Minister, how do you feel? Is it safe in Tel Aviv? And he was bombarding and pounding Gaza. And in the end, he said, like the former Prime Minister of Israel said, we will never forgive the Arabs for forcing us to kill their children. And I looked at the television and said, is this, sorry my language, is this a fucking joke? I mean, I was horrified, and I went to my network, and that morning, one of our journalists, one of the best one we ever had, a reporter who covered the Gaza war in 2012, was Ayman Muhyiddin. And he just filmed 3 kids killed on a beach. He just filmed it. I was in the TV station, and I saw the panic. Because suddenly, there's one story, and it's a major story that was filmed on camera, where you see the missile striking, the first one, killing the first 2, and then the second missile, and this kid is running after, they were actually playing football on the beach. And the third kid, 6-year-old, running, and the second missile come and strike him. And you couldn't explain that. You could there's no justification to this. The telephone started, ringing, and the justification that there was a missile there, and they kept calling, producers kept calling Ayman Muhyiddin, are you sure there was another missile in the area? And he said, no, every journalist was there. We watched it, we filmed it, it's on film. You had 3-4 cameras there. That story was taken from him, given to another one who wasn't even in Gaza. He was in Tel Aviv. He just arrived. And he was actually called out of Gaza because he witnessed that moment. I went on air, and I was with Ronan Farah, and I said, our coverage was not only disgustingly biased, it's a disgrace. We're betraying the American people because we're basically not telling them the whole story. We're lying blandly to them. My every show was canceled, and I left the building knowing that I will never come back. And leaving the building, I remember some of the producer stopping me. They said, well, you don't understand the kind of bullying and harassment and attention. Recently, somebody from, I will not mention name, from the Washington Post was telling me that every article they write, they have to answer to lobbyists and organizations like Camera. And I said, I don't care what kind of harassment, you just stand up to it. Basically, you stand up to it. So when I submit an article and they tell me, and look, supposedly I'm an Arab Muslim black woman telling these nice white guys in these networks, you can't handle a little bit of bullying. I mean, you're in the wrong job. Probably you're not only in the wrong job. If you can't stand up to these thugs, then they will get away with it. They will get away over and again. I am so grateful and thankful that independent organizations exist, like Mondoweiss and Alternate, and I mean now, and these kind of documentary. And what I'm asking all of you, and forgive me if I am shameless about it, we need to support these organizations. These are independent organizations that live on donations. Whatever philanthropy you're doing, this is the ultimate battleground. Whatever you're doing, I will be like Sanders. $7, whatever that is, give it to Mondoweiss, to Alternate, to Catherine to promote her movie, because this will change America forever, will change the public opinion. You know what? When Rupert Murdoch wanted to buy Reuters the first time, and the legal system was clear in the UK, the first thing he said, and he retracted what he said, I don't buy newspapers. And that was a lie, obviously. He said that he used to buy journalists. Guess what? We can actually shift the public opinion. If they put $100 million on one end to manipulate the public opinion, you can put much less, because one footage like that can really shift the public opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question, or should we close the door here? This was more about what you started out talking about, the email exchange. Do you want to talk more about that? That was uncovered, by the way, in a FOIA request made by Grant Smith, and he found it accidentally. And that's a kind of thing that it appalled us when we read it, and would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm really grateful that we expose this, disgusting misogyny. And again, I love when white men lecture me or lecture others about how we go in the Middle East and we invade certain countries to liberate women and women's choices. And then CNN put against me somebody like Rabbi Shmuley. And forgive me if I'm about to throw up. and he's telling me that an Arab woman like myself would never, he's patronizing me about my rights. Basically, they look down at the Middle East, at Arabs, and we're, you know, when I wrote my New York column about minority rights or minority lives in Israel, the only way we're described as Arab Muslims, women, or brown, as either a terrorist or a Bedouin without a nationality. In American media, we're basically, you know, every question starts where, like, how do you feel? As if my job is to feel. My job is to analyze phenomena. Whether I look, sorry, my description, whether I'm tall or short, whether I'm big or small, it does not matter. Whether I look like this or I had some plastic surgery to look like this, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it's about the argument. And since I start working, everything we predicted about the trajectory of the war on terror, the Iraqi war, that it will be, if you listen to whatever any Arab analysts have told you about the war on terror, about invading Iraq, how it will create mass radicalization, will destabilize the entire region, and will basically bring, you know, we had only 200 jihadists after 9/11. Only 200. According to the FBI, there were only 200. Today we have hundreds of thousands of, if that is a success, then what is failure? So every Arab analyst has been saying the same thing. And what is their weapon to throw against people like me? Oh, yeah, her looks. Give me a break. I mean, like, you know what? It didn't hit me, but it explained, I think, to the public a mindset of these thugs and bullies. I'm used to it because I had that in Italy, and I'm exercised because I had ministers in Italy refusing to answer questions because I was a Muslim or I was brown or some kind of things. I mean, you know, I remember interviewing Berlusconi in 2005 the first time. I mean, I usually, it's hard for me to lose. I mean, I have no comment on the kind of, I mean, if you think Berlusconi was bad, imagine when Donald Trump will come up there and will start dealing with journalists. He's already saying, oh, these disgusting people, I hate them, and whatever. I mean, with the kind of attitude that I've seen under Berlusconi for 10 years, was this kind of things, where people, basically women and men who worked for him, would call us and threaten us. Threats, real threats. In a country that killed journalists, actually, these threats can happen, and people, I believe that when you somehow use violent words, this can easily translate it into real violence and killing. It can easily translate it into that. And that's why, again, forgive me for repeating the same thing. We need to create an ecosystem that collaborate much more with each other, that reinforce each other's, and that actually, we have to create a glue, a cultural glue that reinforce and a tissue that reinforce and push back harder. Because I'm sorry, we're not pushing back harder enough, because these thugs are bullies and will throw everything they have, you know, from threats to bullying to harassment to even beating of some journalists. But we live in an era where democracy, luckily, still function. So before it collapses, let's hold it together. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to remind you that Rula will be signing her book at the reception afterwards. And I'm also going to have a comment from Ralph Nader, who said that he'd sure like this audience to know that Al Arabiya News was not allowed to cover AIPAC's convention. They denied Al Arabiya access to the AIPAC.
Weiss, if I'm not wrong, and I'm sure they will deny 80% of the people sitting here. It's not a dialogue. I mean, what's happening in AIPAC on Monday will not be a dialogue. It will be a monologue, and it's like, I mean, I obviously have a Catholic daughter, so I go to church with her sometimes, and I see how they, the way they pray, and I feel like when all of these politicians go to pray to AIPAC, it's just like genuflection, and please kill me more or give me whatever you want. You know, it's painful for somebody that believe in a democratic system and travel around the world and see millions of people standing in the street from Cairo to Algeria to Tunisia, people willing to die for the principle of democracy and equality because they feel like they were born as free men and women. And this is the kind of model they look up to. And what they see on television, they see AIPAC basically squeezing sorry my language, the balls of these people. And these people are basically saying, yes, please, more again.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Grant's going to come up here and speak, but we did have a lot of major media who came to this event, and this room has been bursting to the seams with proof that Americans want to hear these stories. When you go back to your newsroom and write up your stories, please insist that your editors let you do your job. Grant?
Yeah.
Thank
you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We have a special treat for you now. Those red tickets in your badges, those are for a complimentary beverage, which will be served over at the bar. We encourage you to stay, mingle. There's some incredibly important people out there who should have been up here. Seek them out, talk to them. The really important part of this conference is just about to begin. And we do want to remind you that transcripts, video, audio of all of these presentations will be available on that website, israelsinfluence.org. And thank you so much for coming.
And one more thing. I'd like to thank the Washington Report's publisher, Andrew Kilgore, who's been sitting here, and his whole generation of leaders, Ralph Nader, who was here, Harriet Fulbright, who was here, John Mahoney, Gene Bird, and others in this room, and the many students who came. They traveled to D.C. for this day. Audience members, thank you, donors, exhibitors, and advertisers. We couldn't have had this remarkable day without your help. Thank you. Enjoy your drinks. Bye.